Hey everyone, welcome. This video is an introduction to the build called Enki's Arc Witch. Enki created a build and a build guide that are so smooth and so complete that they made their creator kind of a household name in the Path of Exile community. Now, this video here that you're watching is no substitute for reading through and following along the full guide, but it is meant to kind of smooth out the process of getting started, particularly for newer players. I have linked Enki's full forum post in the description of this video. I highly encourage you to read through it if you're liking this video, and I definitely encourage you to download the associated Path of Building file if this video summary seems interesting to you. Path of Building is a crucial tool for understanding how to progress a build, particularly the skill tree. But really, I do need to emphasize that Enki is the creator. He has put in the hard work here, and it's also worth noting that that build guide serves equally well not just as a build guide, but as an introduction to the entire game. Enki makes sure to explain details that experienced players might take for granted, and he explains why certain build decisions are made. And because of that, the build is smooth as butter to progress. All the skill points and the gems, they just seem to come online right when you need them. So it's really elegantly made build. He really has an understanding of what comes online when, and he's designed it well. So clearly, I am not Enki. I'm just a fan, an admirer, and this video is going to serve as a summary of what the build is and an introduction to it. I'm going to highlight its main features, and I'm going to walk you through the process of assembling the build into its most basic form, taking you through the first 3 or 4 acts of the game, because those first few acts, they're often clunky for builds. Not all of your pieces are online yet, not all of your skills, not all of your passive points, and you're often making do with other skills unrelated to your main skill, and you don't have an Ascendancy yet. But with this build, I'm happy to report that the process of getting it online through those first few acts, it can be just as smooth as the rest of this extremely smooth build, as long as you follow along here. But really, you'll find that end of Act 3, beginning of Act 4, that's when the build really starts to click and feel like its end game self. That's where the progression becomes much more intuitive, and you can rely on the Path of Building to kind of guide your way. But for the first few acts, there is a fairly optimal order, in my opinion, to proceed with some of these highly recommended steps. Following these steps exactly is not necessary, it's by no means necessary, but it will certainly help the process feel faster and smoother, and that's going to come during a point in the game when your character is objectively at its weakest, the early game. So that's what this video is going to aim to do. In a 10-act game, we're going to get you from Act 1 through your 4-link arc setup and your first Ascendancy point around the beginning of Act 4. So we're going to take you through probably around 30 to 40% of the game. And around that time, that's when things will start smoothing out. Changes will come less often. You can really lean on the Path of Building and on the build guide at that point, the written guide. I think you'll find that the amount of thought and energy you need to spend doing setup and making changes, it's going to decrease exponentially as we proceed. You're going to have a ton of information and attention and decisions in Act 1, a fair bit in Acts 2 and 3, and then substantially less after that. If you follow along with this video, I guarantee you will have learned enough to easily follow along with the written guide that Enki lays out for how to complete the build. Also, just as an aside, many of the tips and the timings that we're going to cover in this video, they can be applied to other builds as well. They're not necessarily exclusive to this. So let's start with a summary of what the build is that we're looking at. The main skill, as the title implies, is Arc. Arc is a lightning spell that does just what the name implies. It arcs or chains from enemy to enemy automatically, making the playstyle feel very smooth, as we often only have to cast a single time to clear a whole screen of enemies, especially if we've built the damage high enough of the build. And although it's called an Arc Witch, that's just kind of the old classic name of the guide that stuck, and which is indeed the class that we start with. Like all builds, it chooses a subclass or ascendancy, so we don't stay a witch for long. This build is going to choose Elementalist as its ascendancy, in large part due to the massive buffs you get from your multiple elemental golems. Now, if that sounds micromanagey to you, don't worry. One of your Ascendancy points is going to take care of resummoning your golems as soon as they die, and that ends up meaning that they mostly function as colorful stat sticks and meat shields for you, while you get to do all the fun parts. And those fun parts involve zapping enemies with this powerful classic lightning spell. But unfortunately, as with most builds, we can't immediately start with the main skill of Arc. Not all skills in Path of Exile are available right away. In fact, very few are available right away. So, like most builds, we've got to spend at least a few levels using one of those few basic skills that's available from the beginning. Now, luckily, Arc happens to be a skill that comes online comparatively early compared to some others. We're going to get access to it around level 12, which is around the time we enter the final zone or dungeon of Act 1. Those two things happen around the same time. You're going to be hitting level 12 around the time you're entering that last zone, and that's when you're going to get the gem. So it's pretty convenient. But what do we do until then? Here we get started with the step-by-step guide. And so in Act 1, we are going to start with my personal absolute favorite spellcaster setup for the early portion of the game. You can apply this to a lot of different builds, and this is particularly well designed for the new, more difficult rework of Act 1 that happened a few patches ago. So the setup we're going to be working with is Freezing Pulse as our self-casted main skill, Frost Bomb as a debuff for single target enemies, and also a Holy Flame Totem setup, which is versatile in where and when we can use it. So to use this setup, I mostly want to focus here on which socket links we need to find, either through buying them from a vendor or by picking them up off the ground. Because really, that's going to be the main thing limiting your ability to implement these. The skill tree, not a big deal. Enki provides an excellent model tree. It goes act by act, and you really don't need to deviate much from it. So you don't really need to worry about the tree. Also, the gems, they're going to either be offered free as quest rewards, or they can be purchased fairly cheaply with wisdom scrolls from the vendors. So really, the gems, the tree, we don't need to worry too much about that, but the links, we do need to worry about getting items with the right links. Luckily, we do have some flexibility here, actually, and I'll tell you more about that in just a moment, but we can be looking for 3 links as varied as blue, blue, green, blue, 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 red, green, green, red, blue, blue, and blue, green, red. Any of those that you might find will be useful to you in one way or the other. And so, as you can tell from that list, this is very flexible. Almost any 3-link item can be useful to us in some way, but let's at least cover what the ideal links would be. If you've got your choice, what colors should you prioritize? So our main damage dealing setup is going to be Freezing Pulse. This is a blue gem, and ideally we would want to link it with Volley, a green gem which gives us more projectiles. And then also link Freezing Pulse with Arcane Surge as the 3rd gem. It's blue as well, so ideally we're going to be looking for blue, blue, green with Freezing Pulse, the main gem, Volley to give us more projectiles, and Arcane Surge, which gives us a big damage boost after we spend a certain amount of mana on the spell. Unfortunately, we can't do much with any red sockets, at least not for this skill setup, because this character is not going to have access to the added fire damage gem, which otherwise might have served as a substitute if all we could get was a red socket here. But there is some flexibility. You don't necessarily need that green gem. You could, if you found a blue, 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 so all 3 blue sockets linked together, you could substitute out Volley and get added lightning damage instead. It won't clear quite as well, but your single target will be great, so that's a plus. And likewise, if you find blue, green, green, you could substitute out the blue Arcane Surge for added cold damage, which happens to be a green gem. So in that case, you would have Freezing Pulse with added cold and Volley. Also a very good setup. Not quite as good as Arcane Surge, but good. So as long as we don't have a red socket in our main skill setup, we're looking pretty good there. Now, next up, we want to look at our Holy Flame Totem setup. This is a really great skill for a variety of reasons. Its main function, for me, is that it distracts dangerous enemies. This can either be crowds of enemies who might otherwise surround you and overwhelm you, or big single-target scary enemies like Brutus, who's a boss we're going to face partway through Act 1. When Act 1 was reworked, Brutus got pretty scary. The other big thing about Holy Flame Totem is it takes advantage of a certain fact. So in Act 1, the enemies are all balanced around the fact that you're only expected to have 3 link sockets. 4 links aren't available yet, so the enemies are balanced. They have the amount of health that can be killed by a skill with 3 links. More links typically means more damage. But keep in mind, 3 links you can get on any gear that rolls sockets. So we can have several 3 links going as long as we can get the items. Holy Flame Totem can be just as powerful as our main skill setup, and most importantly, it can be dealing damage at the same time. It's a totem. It fires its own stuff. So you set down the totem, it starts firing, and you start firing your main skill of Freezing Pulse. So you're effectively doing about double damage when you've got Holy Flame Totem up. It's great. It's also good for just kind of dropping and running if you're just on the run through the act. It's nice because it doesn't slow you down much. You can just drop it. It'll kill a couple enemies behind you. You don't need to kill everything as you go. In fact, I strongly recommend against killing everything. You kind of want to maintain your character level around the level of the monsters in the area, which you can see at the upper right of the screen. And otherwise, you can just kind of run past them, maybe drop a flame totem here and there, but don't get bogged down in killing every little thing. So, back on Holy Flame Totem specifically. Ideally, we would like to get a red, blue, green link here. So, the gem itself, Holy Flame Totem, is red. We would like to be supporting it with the blue gem Summon Phantasm support. This is going to make even more distractions in meat shields for Brutus. That's great. And Volley is the green gem, which it's the same one we've got in our main Freezing Pulse setup, and it's just very good here as an early option for increasing the number of projectiles and improves our clear tremendously. Now, when you face Brutus specifically, the boss, if you happen to have an added cold damage gem just lying around, you could substitute that into the green socket in place of Volley, but this is far from mandatory. Don't go out of your way. Don't waste a wisdom scroll buying one of these if you're hard up for currency, but if you happen to have an added cold and you want to deal a little bit of extra single target damage, you can swap that in temporarily. Added cold in for Volley. And in fact, this brings up the topic that we've got a lot of flexibility here. You don't even necessarily need to go with that exact 3 socket setup. If, for example, you had 2 blues and a red, so no green, no possibility of having Volley, well, you can take Volley out and put Arcane Surge in instead. Again, you lose some clear, but you gain a lot of damage. Alternatively, if we had 2 greens and a red instead, you could go with added cold in place of the Summon Phantasm support. You just lose a little bit of meat shield, but it's really not a big deal. Those are the 2 main setups we got. However, we also mentioned Frost Bomb. Frost Bomb can do just fine as a single link or a single socket. You don't need to link it to anything. Its intent really is mostly as a debuff to enemy resistances and regeneration. We're usually pretty socket starved this early on in the campaign, so don't worry too much about linking this to anything unless you're just like drowning in sockets, which is uncommon but not unheard of. Maybe that'll happen to you. I personally usually don't link it, but if you really felt the need to, you could go with added cold damage, or you could use Arcane Surge here, but be cautious to keep Arcane Surge at level 1. The reason for that is because the Arcane Surge support, yes, as you level it up, it does increase the effect, increase the damage, but it also makes it so that you have to spend more mana to get that Arcane Surge effect. And you would really ideally just want the Arcane Surge effect every time you cast Frostbomb. You wouldn't want to have to cast it a few times to get the effect. So again, if you do go with Arcane Surge here, which is totally optional, just keep it at level 1. And I would say, honestly, most other supports aren't going to be worth your time here, but technically, if you're just obsessed, technically any of added lightning damage, added cold damage, or phantasm support would all technically work to add some damage to the skill. So those are the ends of our main damage dealing and debuffing skills, but we've just got some odds and ends here. You're going to want a random single blue socket somewhere for your teleport skill. That's going to start off as Frost Blink, a free quest reward, which you can and should pretty quickly replace with Flame Dash, a better teleport skill when it becomes available, which I think is around level 8 from the vendor, and if you've got a spare wisdom scroll to buy it. You're going to want another single blue socket for the Clarity Aura. This is optional, but it's a pretty good idea. We'll talk more about auras later, but in brief, Clarity will allow you to reserve or set aside a certain amount of your mana as unusable for normal casting, called reserving it, and in turn, you get the effect of having your remaining mana regenerate much faster. But we'll talk a little bit more about auras in Act 2. You're also going to want a single red socket somewhere on your gear for Steel Skin. Steel Skin is an instant cast defense skill, and because it's instant cast, we can actually keep it on left click. So as we walk around using left click, it's going to automatically cast this spell as we walk around, and it's not going to slow you down, it's not going to stop you because it's instant cast. That's a really great trick. Highly recommend you either use instant cast or cast when damage taken, which becomes available later in the game. Moving on. You can keep an eye out for more spare blue sockets because eventually we will want to have some blue gem auras. Not yet, but if you just want to be prepared in advance. For the moment, you should only have to use Clarity if you feel you have mana sustain issues, but it can help smooth things out. So that's it for the Act 1 gems. But aside from gems, the things you want to keep your eyes open for are a few pieces for a very nice vendor recipe. If you put these things together, you get a nice weapon. There is a wand that is available at level 8 through a hidden vendor recipe, and this wand has some very nice flat added damage. What you do is you sell the vendor a magic rarity weapon, in other words, a weapon that has a blue title, along with a normal white topaz ring and a single orb of alteration. Now, the weapon you sell him, the magic weapon, should ideally be a rune dagger base because it's got the implicit critical strike chance at the top. But you can also do this with a wand. That's totally fine. Wands have increased spell damage. And it's a little bit less DPS, but totally fine. Rune dagger or wand. The topaz ring that you're looking for, you can either pick it up off the ground, you can purchase it from the vendor, you can even, if you are desperate, sell an iron ring to the vendor along with any green gem, and you will in return get a topaz ring. Orbs of Alteration, they can be picked up off the ground, but you might get unlucky and not have found one by level 8, so you can also assemble them from Shards of Alteration. Shards of Alteration are received for selling identified gear that you find, so you're kind of indirectly trading wisdom scrolls and items you find on the ground to get alteration orbs. You're going to want to have this weapon by the time you face the Act 1 boss, Merveil, so make sure that you are keeping an eye out for those items and creating that weapon. Also, by the time you face Merveil, you're probably going to want to have something with cold resistances on it. It's not mandatory, but at least a ring, a blue gem plus an iron ring, or just buying or finding a sapphire ring to get some cold resist. She does some heavy cold damage, and you will thank yourself if you get a little bit of cold resist before you head in. And that setup, that's going to get you through to the end of Act 1. You're going to be around level 12, maybe a little higher if you've been overkilling enemies when you enter the final dungeon in Act 1, which is called the Cavern of Anger. Entering this dungeon unlocks some new vendor sale options back in town, so I encourage you to head back because notable among these is our main skill, Arc. At this point, if you've got a blue item lying around, in other words, an item with those 3 blue sockets linked together, you are free to switch over to Arc immediately before you face the final boss of the act. You can socket Arc together with Arcane Surge and added lightning damage. All 3 are blue gems. Now, if you happen to only have access to a blue-green item, you could sub out the added lightning damage for added cold damage. This is a little suboptimal because it doesn't synergize as well with the lightning damage nodes that we're taking on the skill tree, but this isn't terrible. We haven't invested a ton into percent lightning damage, so this is still completely feasible. Unfortunately, our Frost Bomb setup is going to lose a lot of its utility at this point since we're now dealing mostly lightning damage. So we don't really need the cold resistance lowering effect from Frost Bomb anymore. You can unsocket it if you are hard up for space, but I would recommend keeping it around on standby because in the middle of Act 2 we are going to face a boss named Oak, and he is a regeneration machine of a boss who is much easier to kill while he's under Frostbomb's regen dampening effects. And just some last cleanup items, some miscellaneous items in Act 1. First, if you find yourself needing some extra damage, now is an excellent time to consider adding in your Orb of Storms setup. You're going to want to add it either at the end of Act 1, beginning of Act 2. Either is fine. Orb of Storms is a classic supplemental skill for helping single target damage. It creates an area with a pulsing lightning ball, and it actually does just fine even unlinked, because its DPS increases when you, the player, are using another lightning skill, in this case, Arc. If your socket pressure is too tight, it's okay at this point to drop the Holy Flame Totem setup. I would rather at this point have the Orb of Storms than the Holy Flame Totem. because Arc is going to have much better clear than Freezing Pulse did. So we're not quite as concerned with being overwhelmed by enemies surrounding you, like I mentioned. And we just don't need the distraction of the totem anymore. You can keep the totem as long as you have the sockets to spare for it, but, drop it when you need to, if you need the sockets for other things. And also, as you're making your way through the first couple acts, don't forget to be doing your Labyrinth trials as you come across them. The written guide will point these out, but be sure to do them. These are required to take our first Ascendancy point, which we're going to do near the beginning of Act 4. And I've been there. It's just irritating to have to go back and find the trials again after you've already been to an area. So don't make my mistake. Just catch them on the first round through. And that should bring us to the end of Act 1. You kill Merveil, and off you go to Act 2. As we move to Act 2, we're going to prepare to do much more work with an important type of gem from an early Act 2 quest, auras. We're going to do much more with auras now. So we talked about Clarity in Act 1, which reserves a flat amount of mana to make the rest of your mana regenerate faster. We're going to be doing with some more kind of standard run-of-the-mill auras that rather than reserve a flat amount of mana, they will reserve a percent, so that it doesn't matter whether your pool of mana says 50, 100, or 10,000, they're going to reserve whatever they say on the gem, 10%, 25%, even 50% of your mana, and this is done to prevent you from stacking too many of them. Just having a ton of mana and reserving a bunch of auras. There are ways that you'll find later in the game of reserving more auras than you should be able to. Nodes on the tree, gear that you can find. But for now, it's pretty much going to be what you see is what you get. And the auras that we're going to pick up to start with are going to be of a subset called Heralds. Heralds each add some type of flat damage and produce an effect whenever you kill an enemy. So we're at the very least going to be using Herald of Thunder, which produces some storms nearby when we kill an enemy. So that's a nice bonus to the clear speed since it happens automatically. And if you've got a spare socket and you don't mind leaning a bit on your mana flask more frequently, you can also activate Herald of Ice. You should have enough spare mana to do both. It's totally optional though. Feel free to try it, see how it feels, see if your mana is too tight by reserving both auras. It's okay though, this isn't a long-term solution in any case because we're going to be replacing those Herald skills in Act 3 with something else, so don't fret too much about it. Around the same time that we get those auras, we are going to unlock Wave of Conviction. Wave of Conviction is very similar to what Frostbomb was for us in Act 1, but it works with lightning and fire damage instead. This is something that you're not going to need to use on every little enemy. It's just one in our arsenal, our tool belt of single target assistance. So in addition to Orb of Storms, we will also have Wave of Conviction to lower enemies' resistance to our damage. Speaking of Orb of Storms, by the way, when we complete the Act 2 quest Sharp and Cruel by killing the Weaver spider boss, we're going to get access to 2 support gems that we want to link to Orb of Storms. You're going to get Power Charge on Critical Strike support. This is going to smooth out our Power Charge generation and therefore Elemental Overload. More on that in the guide. And then Culling Strike is the other gem we want here, which automatically kills anything under 10% life, and that basically amounts to a 10% more DPS boost against any heavy targets that you use Orb of Storms on. Very handy there. And that should, I think, wrap up the gem changes that we're going to make in Act 2. The other Act 2 changes we need to make, so generally, most builds, and this is no exception, during the Bandit Choice quest, you are going to choose to kill all 3 bandits rather than helping any of them, and you will take the 2 skill points and apply them to your tree. That's the reward you get for killing all 3 bandits. None of the bandit rewards are compelling enough in this build to be stronger than 2 skill points. Next up, we are going to do that vendor recipe again, the one that we used to create a weapon in Act 1. This is another version of the same recipe that gives more flat damage, but it can only be used by characters that are level 20 or higher, which is going to happen when we are partway through Act 2. The only difference in the recipe is that rather than a white normal rarity, Topaz Ring, we need a rare or yellow title, Topaz Ring. The only ways you're going to get this are either by finding it on the ground, which is quite rare, frankly. Rare to find, or unusual to find a rare ring, I should say, this early in the game. But the other way that you're going to do this is by using an essence item to turn a white topaz ring into a rare one with one guaranteed modifier. We don't care about the guaranteed modifier. In this case, the essence is just a handy way to get it to be rare. As an aside on that, you should always be killing essence monsters when you come across them. These are the monsters that are locked in the icy prisons that you click on them a couple times to unleash them, and they're represented on your minimap by kind of 3 jagged, icy looking spikes. And you definitely want to kill as many of these as you can. Essences are crucial for the leveling experience. They let you make rare items, and in this case, they let you make an item you're going to use in this vendor recipe. So, always kill your essence monsters. Sell that rare topaz ring that you've probably made with an essence, along with a magic rarity rune dagger and an orb of alteration. So the same 2 ingredients from last time, and the vendor will give you a nice new shiny improved wand with even higher flat damage. If you are absolutely swimming in currency, you could even do this recipe twice and dual wield for even more damage rather than using a shield. That part is up to you. The shield you may find handy for defensive stats. The very last gear upgrade, if you haven't yet found a pair of boots with movement speed, which is definitely a priority, there is a movement speed crafting recipe that you are going to find in the caves near the end of Act 2. So at that point, as soon as you get it, it should be located next to the waypoint. You can teleport right out of there, go to your hideout, and slap movement speed on whatever boots you got, because it is a huge quality of life boost. It's going to speed up your campaign a lot. It's also worth, now that you have access to the crafting bench from Act 2, it's worth using that crafting bench to add life and resist to gear pieces as needed. That's going to become more and more important as you progress through the game. And all of those changes will easily carry us through the end of Act 2 and the boss there. Now, on to Act 3. This is the last full act that we're going to need to complete on our journey to getting the basics of this Archwitch build assembled. In Act 3, we're mostly going to be following along with the story quest progression in Labyrinth Trials. Not too many interruptions, but there's a few standout moments that we need to mention where you're going to need to take some kind of action or decision on your skills or gear. And one of the important things, just to highlight something from the PoE skill tree, this is around the time where you're going to be taking the Elemental Overload keystone, and if you've got any gear on you by chance that is increasing your critical strike multiplier, that gear piece is about to become irrelevant when you take the elemental overload keystone. It won't harm you to have crit multi on your gear, it just won't do anything for you, so feel free to replace it is all I'm trying to say. Elemental Overload, it's got a lower ceiling on damage than if you were to stack a whole bunch of crit chance and crit multi, but it's also way cheaper and way easier. So this is an excellent intermediary where we don't have to waste a lot of time and spots on our gear with crit chance and crit multi. We just get a lot of oomph out of our critical strikes in a cheap and easy way. Anyways, moving on. The next moment that we need to focus on is when we complete the first major quest in the act. It's called Lost in Love, and you'll know you've completed it because you've received the sewer keys as a quest reward to let you move forward. Now at this point, we can pick up the Wrath Aura gem from the vendor, and we can use that to replace any heralds that we might have had, reserving our mana. Turn the heralds off, unsocket them, and turn on Wrath instead. This is a much more direct source of lightning damage than the heralds were. If at this point you happen to have a Holy Flame Totem still lingering around, now's the time to ditch it. It's not going to be receiving nearly enough benefit to be worth casting it anymore, just not worth the time, and it's certainly not worth the sockets, because Holy Flame Totem is not dealing any lightning damage, and Wrath is a bonus to lightning damage. So now's a great time to get rid of that and free up those sockets for something else. The other major thing that happens in Act 3, and really the only major decision-making point, is you're going to get access to the library near the end of the act. The library is technically an optional quest, which is located off the Imperial Gardens, but it's only optional in the strictest sense. Really, you're going to want to do this. The rewards are enough to make it basically mandatory. You gain access to a huge vendor list of gems that your class would not normally get access to. It's not quite every gem in the game. That you don't unlock until the beginning of Act 6, but it's a lot, and we need several of them. So bring your currency with you, since irritatingly enough, the library vendor does not respect whatever's in your stash. It won't take currency from your stash. You've got to have it on you in person. Some of these gems cost chance orbs to buy, so you're going to be wanting to hoard those jealously in anticipation of the library. Don't sweat it if you don't have enough chance orbs when you first arrive. Into Act 4, chance orbs are going to start dropping a lot more frequently. And so if any of the gems that I'm about to list, you don't have the currency to buy immediately, that's okay. Just make a note of them, set it aside, and when you get some chance orbs later in Act 3 or into Act 4, come on back and get the skills at that time. So in total, here's what you're going to want to buy. You're going to want to buy the Green Onslaught gem. This is another support for Orb of Storms, so this is only going to be possible if you've got a 4-link with 2 greens and 2 blues, because keep in mind it will already be linked to Power Charge on Crit and Culling Strike, so this will be the 4th gem in that link is Onslaught. Next, we're going to get Molten Shell, a red gem to replace Steel Skin. We're going to put that on our left click instead of Steel Skin. If you happen to have a second linked red slot around, you can also buy Increased Duration. You'll link it to Molten Shell just to make its effects last longer. Simple setup there. For our main damage dealing setup, we are going to be buying Lightning Penetration Support. It's going to be replacing Arcane Surge. We're going to be buying Inspiration Support, a red gem to replace added lightning damage. Keep in mind that is a change in coloring, so we may need a different gear piece at this point. Now, if you happen to find a 4-link early, so around this time, this would be the earliest that you might find a 4-link, you can keep one of those old gems around, either Arcane Surge or added lightning damage at your discretion. But keep in mind, in Act 4, you're still going to end up replacing whatever it is when you get access to Spell Echo as a quest reward. But for the time being, if you so happen to have a 4-link, you can go with Arc, Lightning Penetration, Inspiration, and then one of added lightning damage or Arcane Surge. But you really do want to have access to Inspiration. It is great for controlling your mana costs. Next up and last up, we want to pick up a couple of red gems, Determination and Defiance Banner. They are aura gems, and you are probably going to have to level these without activating them for now. You probably will not have enough mana, certainly to activate both of them. You may be able to activate Defiance Banner, but eventually you are going to path on your skill tree sometime in the next couple of acts to some nodes that reduce how much mana it costs to reserve auras. And you're going to need those nodes to fit in, especially Determination, which is a big reservation. I think it's a full 50%. Now, if you're feeling squishy in Act 4, you can depart from Enki's prescribed guide a bit just by swapping the order in which you take the lightning nodes, which he has you taking first, the ones at the very top of the tree, the ones that end in Heart of Thunder. You can bypass those very briefly, and you can instead go to the left side of the tree and pick up the mana reservation nodes. Totally up to you, and really only need to do that if you're feeling squishy. Otherwise, go ahead and follow right along with how Enki has you proceed. But yeah, those two, either the lightning nodes or the mana reservation nodes, they cost about the same number of points, so you can kind of choose which ones you want to do first. You can beeline for the aura nodes first if you want to squeeze in Determination for more survivability. But that should bring us to the end of Act 3 without too many major changes. There are some builds who will go for our first Ascendancy point, our first Labyrinth, before the final boss in Act 3, Dominus. And there's plenty of good reasons to do that. Dominus is a tough boss. You want the added power boost from your Ascendancy, but I'm going to recommend that we don't. It's going to fit better if we wait until the beginning of Act 4 before we get our Ascendancy. But if you feel the need, all of your Labyrinth trials should be in place at this point, so that is up to you. But my intent is to get you through the quest right at the beginning of Act 4 before we do this, and here's why. We're very close to being able to get the main skeleton, the main outline of our build online, but this last step is pretty important. Act 4 is where you're going to get early access to your golem gems, and golems are the whole basis of your first 2 Ascendancy points. So for that reason, what I recommend is that your last few level ups that you get near the end of Act 3 and at the beginning of Act 4, I'd like you to start pathing preemptively toward Golem Commander near the top of the skill tree. Golem Commander will let us really take advantage of our first Ascendancy points the moment they come online, because Golem Commander lets us have another Golem summoned. And our Ascendancy is going to actually double the benefit of all golems we've got in play. So this is a big 1-2 punch to hit Golem Commander and our Ascendancy back to back. The golem gems are going to become available to us as soon as we complete one of the first quests called Breaking the Seal. Once you have freed the spirit of Desheret using her banner, the gem rewards for golems are going to be unlocked. And the ones we're going to want to pick up, there are 4 of them, are Flame, Lightning, Stone, and Chaos. We can only use one at first. That's the natural limitation that all characters have. We can pick up a second by getting Golem Commander, and a third from our first Ascendancy point that we're going to get from the Labyrinth. You choose which 3 of those 4 golems you want to use, but you should be leveling the 4th one either in an offhand or just in an available gem socket regardless. It'll come online when you get your second Ascendancy point later in Act 7 or 8. Now, it's recommended that you use Lightning, Stone, and Flame Golems for cast speed, life regen, and DPS respectively, but as with Determination Aura, you can modify this if you're feeling squishy. You could always use the Chaos Golem, which reduces the physical damage you take. You could sub that in for the Flame Golem, so you lose a little bit of DPS, but you gain some physical damage reduction. It's a trade-off. But at this point, you've got your Golem gems, and this is the moment you've been waiting for. You should have already completed your 6 Labyrinth trials in Acts 1 through 3. You should be slightly over-leveled for the first Labyrinth. It's got an area level of 33, and you're probably going to be a bit higher than that right now. And you're ready to go kick Izaro's ass and unlock your first Ascendancy points. It is strongly recommended by me that Stone Golem be one of the 2 golems that you bring into the lab with you, since the regen will also partially counteract the bleeds that can be inflicted by Labyrinth traps. These are a common killer of new players, so bring your Stone Golem with you, make sure he stays summoned. Once you have beaten Izaro's 3 phases spread across the whole Labyrinth, that's it. Use the enchantment font to add a crappy enchantment to your gloves, then go over to the Altar of Ascendancy, which is the real highlight here. Every time you ascend, you get 2 points, so you're always going to be picking up 1 little minor node and 1 major node, the major node obviously being the main reason we're here. I'd like you to ascend as Elementalist and pick Elemancer as your first major Ascendancy node. You are going to ascend a total of 4 times for any character, so this is your first of 4 major nodes, and that is it. You now have the ability to summon 3 golems. You are getting big buffs from each of them. You are well on the way with the build now. All of kind of the major functions of the build are unlocked now. You should have a feel for how things work, when to lay down your spells, making sure that your golems are all around, all that good stuff. I think the only last note to mention is use your crafting bench to upgrade your resistances, particularly after Act 5, when you're going to suffer a permanent, mandatory penalty to your resistances. And other than that, you should be good to go. I will let the written guide and the path of building take over from here. Thank you for tuning in. Leave any questions you've got in the comments, and take it easy, everybody.